So hi everyone, and welcome to our talk series, which is titled The Role of Scientists on a Planet in Crisis. I'm Francisca, and I will moderate today's session. This is a weekly talk series, and we have two more coming up in the next 2 weeks. And it is organized by Extinction Rebellion, which is an international activist group that engages in nonviolent direct action and wants to get scientists and academics to actually act as if we are in a climate and ecological emergency. As people are trickling in, please use the chat to say hello and where you're from so that everybody can see who is participating today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. For anyone who needs translation into Espanol or Francais, please click on the icon that looks like an earth ball at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a ball. And there you can select your language of choice. Please keep your microphone muted during the whole talk and the camera off. If you want to make a tweet of this talk or a social media post, then please use the hashtag SRTalks. There will be a Q&A after the talk, and we kindly ask you to put your questions in the chat. You can do that at any time during the talk or after it, and just clearly label them with questions so we can find them better. To make it smooth, we will call your name, and then you can unmute yourself and turn your video on to ask your question in person. You can also ask your question in Spanish or French, and the interpreters will translate it. After the Q&A, we will give an overview about Scientist Rebellion, and after the overview, we have time for discussion in the breakout rooms, which is often the most fun part of the entire talk. But I don't want to keep you very long with all this housekeeping stuff, because I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today. For me, as a rebel for Scientist Rebellion and as a scientist, it is very clear that we cannot have a growing economy on a planet where we are already using too many resources. It just doesn't make sense because our planet isn't growing. However, when you tell people about that, it makes sense to them that we cannot go on as we are, but they don't know how to change the system. So they always ask you or ask us a lot, okay, so you want us to get away from a growth-based economy, but what are the alternatives? And one of the alternatives I really like to point out when I get to ask these questions is the doughnut economy that we are going to talk about today. And I'm super excited that we have Professor Kate Raworth here today and Dr. Andrew Fanning to tell us more about the doughnut economy. I'm going to give you a little bio of each of them so you know how they are involved in the project, and then I will give over to them. Professor Kate Raworth is a renegade economist focused on making economics fit for the 21st century realities. She is the creator of the Doughnut of Social and Planetary Boundaries and co-founder of Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Her internationally best-selling book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, has been translated into over 20 languages, so much more than we have translation today, and has been widely influential with diverse audience from the UN General Assembly to Pope Francis to Extinction Rebellion. Yes, very much something to celebrate for sure, Kate. Dr. Andrew Fanning is data analyst and research lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab and a visiting research fellow in the Sustainability Research Institute. He was previously the recipient of a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship funded by the European Commission for the project Living Well, Provisioning Systems for Sustainable Resource Use and Human Well-Being, hosted at the Sustainability Research Institute. Andrew's research in the fields of ecological, Economics explores how to move towards a world where people can achieve their aspirations while ensuring the burdens of economic activities are both ecologically safe and socially just. Thank you so much, Kate and Andrew, for being here today, and I can't wait to hear you talk. So I'll give the mic over to the two of you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to kick off, but what we say is deeply connected. So thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you. I'm glad you read out that we like to tell the world how proud we are that Doughnut Economics is influential with the UN General Assembly, Pope Francis, and Extinction Rebellion. That's what we tell everybody because that matters to us a lot. So it's a real pleasure to join you here for this Science Rebellion. Andrew and I work together at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And we're going to talk about the work that we're producing there. He is our self-declared data nerd. And so I'm going to leave it to Andrew when he jumps in to bring all the analysis, the stats, the data rich. So if you want that part of the story, he's going to bring that. What I'm going to bring has absolutely no numbers in it, I think. I'm gonna, because I think what I want to talk about is the paradigm. It's the worldview that shapes what we therefore then see as economics and shapes the relationship between economics and the living world. And of course, it can be drawn. You don't need any equations. You don't even need the data. You need a pen. It can be drawn with a pen. And the pictures we draw profoundly shape what we see, and they shape the paradigms that make the world. So I'm going to focus on that for now. So let me share my slides. I studied economics at university. I'm sitting in the city of Oxford. I moved back here in 2002 to work for Oxfam, which is based here, but I was a student here decades before that, studied economics in the 1990s. And so I inherited an economist's worldview, and it took me a couple of decades of working in Zanzibar, working for the UN, working for Oxfam to be grounded enough in the real world economy to come back and question the paradigm that I'd been taught. And it's so critical to me that we question this paradigm that I'm going to share it with you now, give you a whirlwind tour of the 20th century economics that we need to leave behind and some of the 21st century ideas that I believe equip us with the mindset that we need to then bring economics into the 21st century. So I'm going to kick off with, my clicker's not working. Okay, I'm going to kick off with the 20th century mindset that we inherit. And this is what we inherit if we study economics in a university department, but also if we just listen to politicians talking, if we listen to economists, if we read the economic news, because this mindset has a very long tail and it profoundly shapes what we see and what we put at the center of our vision. So in three core images, I'm going to use pictures here to summarize the worldview. The first image, when I ever speak to anybody who ever studied economics, however old they are, I say, what's the first image you remember learning? And the answer is the same across the world. It is the crisscross of supply and demand. So the first thing people remember learning when they learn economics, welcome to economics, here is the market. And that's a very political act in itself to tell us that actually the first thing you need to know about the economy is how the market works, and that we're going to use this model that puts price at the center of our vision. So immediately price has become the metric of concern. And that means that anything that falls outside of the price contract gets called by economists an externality because it falls outside this very thing we've put at the center of our vision. Now, this puts us in a situation of describing today the ongoing death of the living world. Economists will say, yes, we can talk about that. We call that an environmental externality. And right there, for me, that is reason enough to leave this mindset behind. There's no way we will do justice to our planetary home if we call its deep demise an environmental externality. So that's the first image. I'm going to move now to the selfie. How is humanity portrayed in this mainstream economic mindset that fills the textbooks I have on the shelves behind me? It's a character called Rational Economic Man. And his picture is never actually drawn, but I decided since pictures are powerful, I wanted to give him a visualization. He would look something like this. He would be a man. He has no dependents. He stands alone, independent of mind and opinion. He has money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and he has nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. These are the traits that are given in equations, in models, to humanity, treated as a good enough version of us for then creating economic models that would then predict our behavior. The deep challenge with him is not just how absurdly narrow these characteristics are. The real problem is that on being told that he's like us, students actually become more like him. So research in universities have found from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 of their studies that more that students learn about this character of rational economic man, the more they admire his traits, the more they say it's valuable to be competitive, to be self-interested. That's what it means to be a good economist, to be a good player in the economy. And so we actually undermine our own capacity. Who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. So the stories we tell ourselves about humanity, whether in economics or political science or sociology or any discipline, shape who we become. They are performative on us. If we are going to thrive, 10 billion people on this planet, we need a far richer portrait as a starting point for who we have the potential to be. And then the goal. The goal of the economy is so deeply written into the theory that you won't even find this picture in a single textbook. It's never drawn, but it underlies every economic conversation, and Francisco's already mentioned it. It's the goal of endless growth, that the success of the economy, and this is the shape of progress of the 20th century economic mindset. It's an ever rising line. The notion of growth is good, more is better. And it's measured in GDP, which is gross domestic product, or national income, the value of goods and services sold in an economy in a year. The irony of it, or the absurdity of it, is that no matter how rich a country is already, the idea is that its success depends upon yet more growth. So I'm sitting in the UK. I live in one of the richest nations in the history of humanity. And I'm sure many of you are sitting in some of the richest nations in the history of humanity. But listen to your politicians, listen to your economists. The success of your nation and the solution to your nation's problems lie in yet more growth, endlessly. To me, these three concepts, this first image, the selfie, and the goal of growth, profoundly shape and underpin the 20th century mindset that I would say underpins neoliberal thinking and neoclassical economics. So this is kind of neoclassical economics harnessed for a neoliberal agenda. And it led us, I think, to the beginning of a 21st century that has shown us repeated crises, from the financial meltdown of 2008 to the era of climate and ecological breakdown, which has created a backlash against protests. So the crackdown we've seen worldwide on those protesting against that climate and ecological breakdown, and then 2 years of COVID lockdown. And of course, acknowledging the current crisis in Ukraine and the as yet unknown repercussions that this is going to have worldwide, both on energy, on fossil fuel use, on militarization. We are in an era of crises. And these crises I'm showing you here emerge, I believe, from the very systems on which they depend. They emerge from systems based upon endless expansion. They also show us how interdependent we are with each other and with the rest of the living world, and that their impacts hit with extreme inequalities of gender and of race, of wealth and power between the global north and the global south. So how do we emerge from an era of endless crisis based on a system of endless expansion? Can we come up with a new vision, a new shape of progress? And this is where the donut comes in as one of many possible propositions for reimagining the shape of progress. Again, saying what I said, that the pictures matter, the shapes we show ourselves of what progress looks like. So the goal of the donut, think of it as a compass for human prosperity this century. And the goal is, as we use Earth's resources radiating out from the center of that picture, the goal is to leave nobody in the hole. Leave nobody falling short on the essentials of life without the resources they need for food and water, housing, healthcare, political voice, income, equity. I crowdsourced these from the world's governments, from the Sustainable Development Goals. And the power of that is that all the governments in the world have already agreed that all people in the world have the right to meet these essentials. So leave no one in the hole. But as we seek to meet our needs, we use Earth's resources. We use timber, we use water, we've used fossil fuels, we use fertilizer. And so we start to put pressure on our planet. And we must ensure that just as we want to leave no one below the social foundation, we must also not overshoot that ecological ceiling, which is where we put so much pressure on the life-supporting systems of our planetary home that we kick them out of balance. And these come from the 9 planetary boundaries recognized by Earth system scientists in 2009, Johan Rockström, Will Steffen, and around 29 others. They say these are the life-supporting systems that our planet depends upon to stay within the Holocene-like era of the Holocene era of the last 11,000 years. So put those together and you've got a very different shape of progress. It's not an endless line of growth. It's thriving in balance. And if I just do this with my hands, it's almost like a heartbeat. Leave no one in the hole. Don't overshoot the limits. Can we live in dynamic balance? When I first drew this in 2012, I took the planetary boundaries and I drew a circle within their circle and it came out as a donut. I was amazed by the impact this one picture had, the response that people had to it. And it made me think about the shape of progress. And I looked at how indigenous cultures have for millennia depicted their conception of wealth, of prosperity, of well-being. And it's no surprise, they used this very shape of dynamic balance within a circle. And then suddenly the Western concept of progress as endless growth becomes the immediate outlier. So to me, this is a long journey. Can the Western mindset recover, relearn, learn from others, and come to actually discover a thriving balance rather than believing that progress lies in endless growth? If balance is the shape of progress, well, we are very far from that right now, as all of the red in this image shows. This is the global donut. So this is the proportion of people worldwide falling short on the essentials of life. The red wedge on food goes 11% of the way to the center because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough to eat every day. We want to eliminate all of the red on the inside of that circle. But at the same time, we're overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. The ecological ceiling is set at 350 parts per million on carbon dioxide emissions. We know that we're way over 415. And we're over on biodiversity loss, on fertilizer use, on land conversion. And in fact, scientists recently have recognized we're way over on chemical pollution too. So this is a double whammy of a challenge. We need to come back into the donut from both sides at once. What I'm showing you here is the global picture. And Andrew is going to show you what happens when we take this story down to the national level and we see really interesting differences between nations. So I'm going to hold here and say, what would it take to turn this story around? If this is to be the generation, we tell ourselves this is the decade of climate action. If this is to be the generation where we stop overshooting and falling short and we actually start coming back into the donut, what would that take in terms of the economic mindset that we'd be teaching in schools and universities, that we'd be using in parliaments and in journalism, and that economists will be actually applying? So that's the goal of Doughnut Economics. What would it look like to give ourselves the mindset we need to create a thriving 21st century economy? So I'll share a few ideas. The first picture would never be supply and demand. We don't just start with the market. It's far too narrow. I start with this diagram that I call the embedded economy diagram. It draws on ecological economics, feminist economics, and commons theory. So we've got the economy embedded in society. It is a social construct. That's good news because it means we can reconstruct it. And human society embedded in the living world. We're drawing in materials, we're putting out waste, we're bathed in a river of solar energy. This diagram means that we have got an ecological economics perspective from day one. Economy embedded in the living world. Therefore, economy must obey the laws of thermodynamics. Economy must work with the cycles of the living world. It changes everything when you start here rather than with the market. And then let's look inside. The economy is not just the market. The economy is made up of multiple forms of provisioning for ourselves. So mainstream economics starts in the market space. Yes, there we may be a consumer or producer. You're shopping or working or shopping or working. But also when we're talking about the space of production, are you a laborer earning a wage or a capital owner getting dividends and profits and rents? Karl Marx pointed out this really, really matters where you fall in the relations of power of production. So that's the market space. Mainstream economics says, yes, okay, we've got to make markets work. And sometimes they don't work. So we need the state. the state may need to step in and provide public services. And in the space of the state, who we may be is public servant, a politician, a doctor, a nurse, a bus driver, providing those public goods. We may be residents, we are voters, and we are protesters. And all of these are important relations that each one of us can play in relation to the state. Now this horizontal, this is what shows up in GDP, the output of the market and the output of the state. And that's reflected in national accounts, and that's what grows. But it's missing, of course, massive other spaces of value creation. The household, where we begin every day. We may be parent or partner, relative or child. The unpaid caring work, cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, nurturing, caring, teaching the kids. This is what makes life work, and it's totally unrecognized by mainstream economics. And then let me add the commons, where we co-create goods and services that we value. We come together as a community, and through following shared rules, co-create things we value. Extinction Rebellion being a very powerful example of that. So we may be a volunteer, a sharer, a co-creator, a steward in this space, whether it's Wikipedia, whether it's a neighborhood garden on the corner of your block, or whether it's indeed Science Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion. These are all forms of provisioning, and these vertical ones are missed from national accounts. COVID actually is a very useful example of seeing what happens when the market space is closed due to the need for physical distancing. Well, a lot of it went online, and a few billionaires got extremely rich from dominating digital networks. But also the public sector steps in, and we suddenly had big debates about whose work is essential work, and therefore why they paid so little. Households step in, caring for the sick, homeschooling kids, huge pressure on households to manage that onload of care. And then the commons step in, whether with a community kitchen, with a street WhatsApp group, people looking out for each other. And one thing people have said coming out of the COVID crisis is we don't want to lose this bigger sense of the we. We are not merely rational economic man. We are social humans who interact with each other and depend upon each other. How can we create space in our economies that recognize all of these forms of provisioning? Let me pull back to this donut. How do we turn around the fact that this clearly shows us there's huge inequalities in the world, social deprivation because of inequality, and overshoot because of the way we are running down the living world? We need to transform the dynamics of our economy to becoming regenerative and distributive by design. So we've inherited degenerative industrial processes. We take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away. And that is what's pushing us over Earth's boundaries, running down the sources, overfilling the sinks. We need to turn these linear degenerative arrows into circular, cyclical, regenerative, so that resources don't get used up. They're used again and again. And this is how nature works. Nature breaks materials down into the building blocks of life and then creates life again. That's her genius. Can humanity create an economy that actually mimics and belongs on planet Earth alongside nature, working within the cycles of the living world? A couple of examples of what this can look like at the scale of landscape, from degradation to restoration. At the scale of industry, from that linear degenerative economy to a circular regenerative one. Far greater care taken over resources and the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people where they're dumped. At the scale of a city, this 10-lane highway in Seoul was removed and replaced with a nature-centered district. How can we bring nature back to the heart of cities so that cities begin to mimic the generosity of the living world? And coming right in, this comparison of a nature-less hospital in the UK, not a growing thing in sight. Compare that to this hospital in Singapore, where we know that everyone heals and gets better faster when they are able to see the living world. So these are just some illustrations of that shift from degenerative to regenerative. But also we've inherited economies that are divisive through infrastructure, through privilege, through regulation, inheritance. They tend to capture opportunity and value in the hands of a few. And we need to transform that to become distributive so that they share value and opportunity with all who co-create. Let me give you a few examples from cities and places. In Bangkok, this district had many people migrating into the city to look for work, squatting on government land. To their credit, the government then said, we will give you a long-term lease on this land. We will give you a budget to work with architects. You create a commons, a community of households. You design your own neighborhood. So creating secure housing for communities that were in extreme vulnerability. Here, example from Airbnb, which we know is jacking up prices of rents in many cities and turning it into Fairbnb, where one property, one landlord, and money going into the community. I just use this example to show that a small design in the intent of an enterprise can actually be very powerful in redesigning the outcomes. Urban sprawl, here's Atlanta, with every house its own driveway and garden, means everybody is committed, locked into driving everywhere. Much smarter, something like Paris's 15-minute city. Actually, let's have public and social amenities. So far more distributed public provisioning of access to shared luxury, what George Monbiot calls public luxury rather than private luxury. And then London is known as the city of the greatest loneliness. How do we move away from divisive living and create intergenerational community spaces? So these are just, again, some examples of divisive. So let me pull back out. I'm going to finish in a moment and hand over to Andrew. To turn this story around, we need to change the deep dynamics of our economies from degenerative to regenerative, from divisive to distributive. And we moved a long way in this process from these ideas of 20th century economics that I'm still shocked are still underlie the economic mindset that is taught to so many students worldwide. We've traveled to this 21st century mindset, which I believe is part of a starting point that we need. This is not at all the whole answer, and it's not the final answer, but Doughnut Economics intends to engage with many different ways of thinking. Say, come on, let's go on this journey. Let's draw and model and create new policies that take us here. And one of the most important things for doing that is creating the metrics. If we're going to draw a new image, we need new ways of measuring and showing that in numbers and showing it, making it visible in the world. And that's why Andrew's work is such an essential part of what we do. So at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we created this organization because people couldn't resist playing with a donut in communities, in schools, in urban design. And so we set up a platform. We invite all of you to come and check it out, to become a member. There we share tools and stories of people putting these ideas into practice. We believe 21st century economics will be practiced first and theorized later. So we're hanging out with the practitioners because this is where we think the greatest momentum's happening. So I'll stop here and hand over to Andrew to show you the insights of his analysis. Thank you.
Really great. Thank you, Kate. So I'll just jump right in and then we can get to discussions and questions after. So hello, everybody. I'm also very, very glad to join you all today. So it does mean a lot to me to be a part of this series of talks with Scientist Rebellion. So, okay, Kate has now introduced the paradigm, the embedded economy, the donuts, and the need to transform these big dynamics of our economies from being degenerative
pour me dire des trucs à faire.
To just switching into French. But I think it's okay now, or at least that's what I heard. So, right, so degenerative to regenerative, divisive to distributive. And I have also prepared some slides, so let me just share those now. Just disappeared as always, Zoom. Great. So my part here today, as Kate mentioned, is to be the data nerd and to bring it down to a level where we can, where I just share some additional comments on what it could look like to translate these global concepts and operationalize them from an indicator-based perspective down to smaller scales where oftentimes it can be used as an input for policy making at national scale or city scales and so on. So the starting point is, as before, the global donut, which we've seen shows humanity living far out of balance. But we know that there are these vast inequalities across humanity in terms of responsibility for overshooting these planetary boundaries, which are overwhelmingly caused by the wealthy elites and societies of the world. And also, as well, there's a capacity, the ability to reach the social foundation, and both of those questions have historical legacies and power dynamics wrapped up in them. So what we wanted to do was bring it down to the national level, where I led a study that tracks countries' progress with respect to the donut since the early 1990s across nearly 150 countries. And if we look at 3 of those countries across the range, here are some national donuts. And let me start with Malawi. So with a level of economic activity of just $1,000 per year per person, Malawi, we can see that they're massively falling short on meeting their residents' most essential needs. So there's a lot of red in the middle of that donut. But at the same time, it's not overshooting any of the ecological boundaries that we measure. Then we have China, which is like the global donut, partly falling short and already an overshoot. So it's got that double whammy of needing to meet its residents' needs for the first time, while at the same time coming back within planetary boundaries. And then I've shown Sweden here, but you could throw virtually any high-income nation, and you can see generally a high level of social performance, at least based on this global comparable standard, but at the same time, just a massive level of overshoot of its pressure on the planet. And again, you can throw the United States, you can throw Canada, where I was born, or many other countries, and a similar picture comes out. Now here is nearly 100 countries, and this chart shows the number of social thresholds that a country achieves compared to the number of biophysical boundaries that it transgresses. And you can see Malawi in the bottom left, and China and Sweden in the top right. And I think it's illustrative because lots of us, including myself, are here from EU countries, and we can show them as well, at least those which have comparable data. And the goal, of course, is to be in the top left in the donut, where we achieve all the social thresholds without transgressing any of the biophysical boundaries. But of course, what we see is that there's no country that can put up its hand and say that it's living in that space, that safe and just space, as shown. And so what it says to me is that, every nation must transform in order to get into the donut. But of course, there are different pathways in order to get there. Now, this chart is showing a snapshot of the most recent year's data. But of course, another part of this study is we wanted to look at directionality. We wanted to know whether there are any countries that are moving towards this space or away from it or what have you. And the best response we have been able to find is shown here. So here's a picture of country trajectories since the beginning of the 1990s. And countries are now color-coded with respect to the area where they start out in at the beginning of the period. And the lines there illustrate the trajectories. And overall, what we find is that countries are tending to transgress biophysical boundaries first and before they start achieving a substantial number of social thresholds. So we see nations moving from the left to the right along the bottom of that chart before they start moving up. And actually, if you look really closely, you'll also see in the bottom left, there's a group of countries who actually don't seem to be moving much over the period at all. And in the top right, similarly, another group. And then, and those would be corresponding to more low-income nations and high-income nations, and a group of countries in the middle income or low income, who are kind of moving along that space. And Costa Rica, we find, really stands out in terms of transforming resources most efficiently than any other nation into levels of social achievement. But it's still transgressing, it's still following that general trend. But I do believe that every place has its own history and context. But I think Costa Rica's, if you look at their historical performance, their emphasis on universal basic services like health and education, as well as a dedicated effort to reforest after decades of deforestation. So since the 1990s, there's been a concerted and successful effort to rewild and reforest their country, which I think a lot of other countries can learn from. So if we work with this, we can also, another way of illustrating countries over time that I've been looking at is we can look again at 3 countries across this range, where we have Nigeria, China, and the USA. And Nigeria and the USA actually correspond to those 2 groups I mentioned earlier, who didn't seem to be moving much, at least in terms of the number of boundaries transgressed and social thresholds achieved. But if you look especially, well, certainly for high-income nations, if you look at the extent of ecological overshoot over this period, what we see in virtually all high-income nations is that has been increasing since the 1990s. And here's what it could look like if we continue along current trajectories out to 2050. So the left-hand side with the green lines, these charts are essentially showing the percentage of countries within the boundary for each biophysical indicator over time. And the right hand, the blue lines, are showing the percentage of countries that achieve the thresholds for each social indicator that we measure. I won't go into details on the specific indicators, but we want all of the lines to be going up, essentially. And what we see overall is that the results very much suggest that if current trends continue, things will get worse for almost all of the biophysical indicators in terms of the number of countries who are respecting their fair shares of their boundaries. And for the social indicators, our results, they suggest modest, but still insufficient. I mean, we want all nations to be achieving these minimum social thresholds that we achieve, which are not an excellent lifestyle. It's a minimum. So this is what we find. There's, of course, with any projections or any forward-looking analyses, big caveats here. And essentially the caveat is that these are very simple projections for each indicator, which are derived from historical trends within each country. So on the one hand, our projections could be seen as optimistic because they don't take into account any of the potential social disruption that could arise from continued ecological overshoot. So we know that countries can overshoot biophysical boundaries for a little while, but this can't continue indefinitely. At the same time, these projections could also be seen as pessimistic because we're assuming current provisioning systems and policies, and they don't consider any of the types of radical transformations that have been suggested by many researchers and policy analysts and activists and change makers and many others. So it's a picture, but there's still very much that we can change. So with this analysis, I wanted to leave here is that from the perspective of the donut, we just maintain that really we're all developing countries now. So this chart shows a set of national donuts plotted by their average extent of social shortfall and ecological overshoot. So we want to be in that green area in the top left, once again, where no country currently is. But we can think of the low-income nations of the world and ask ourselves, how can they take that journey towards getting into the donut? Because that's a pathway that's never been done. We can see all other nations have been transgressing boundaries on their way to achieving higher levels of social achievement. Then we can as well think of emerging and middle-income countries like China facing that double whammy of needing to get back within while meeting the needs of their residents for the first time. What does that journey look like for them? It's new, it's never been traveled before. How do we get there? And then of course, think of the high-income nations where many of us are sitting and where I am sitting. How can they take that same journey? Just recognize that, we need a lot of ambition. We need, in this particular case, a decent dose of humility, I believe, to undertake this unprecedented transformation to massively reduce the levels of resource use enjoyed by most people in our societies while maintaining or increasing the social welfare of our societies. So that is a whirlwind tour of a lot of the data that we looked at, but of course we also need to keep in mind the limitations of this analysis. For me, the biggest one is that this is a national analysis, but we know that countries aren't living this like separate, isolated realities. They're deeply interconnected through histories, through power, and that we have colonialism, there's military power, the international system with its trade and finance rules, which are skewed in favor of the wealthiest, through resource extraction, climate change impacts, which are felt first and hardest by many of the world's poorest nations who have contributed essentially nothing to it. So lots of things are missed here. But I guess what it really shows is that we've entered this era where we need transformative action that demands transformation within all countries, and some far more than others, but also between them. But I do believe that to find entry points for transformative action, global comparative analyses like these, they can almost flatten so much of the richness of what it lives to be in a place with a local context and a local history, and just knowing that we all have a unique place where we live. And this is where our work with cities and regions really comes in. So we created this framework that asks a different question. Instead of comparing ourselves to others to see how we perform, we're asking, how can this place help bring humanity into the donut? And the way we think of it is as unrolling the donut to open up space where we can envision a future, to explore possible futures between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. And we can use that space as a canvas to start, just mapping on initiatives, targets, indicators, and challenges and opportunities. And it's really based on a core question, which we invite every 21st century city or place to ask themselves. And it's, how can our place become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And wrapped up in that question are 4 fundamental additional questions that set out the local aspirations of your place in a world of global responsibilities. So first of all, how can all the people of your city or your place, I'll frame it in terms of cities, but I invite you to think of it in terms of whatever type of settlement that you like. But how can all the people of your city thrive? So we know that everyone has similar needs in terms of food, sanitation, and health and education, but the ways in which we satisfy those needs vary enormously from culture and over time. So what does it mean to achieve that here is best responded by those who live there. Then we can ask, how can your place thrive within its natural habitat? So what if your place could aspire to be as generous as the healthy ecosystem next door, and aim to store carbon or house biodiversity or cycle water and nutrients like nature does, as if it were embedded and evolved and a part of the ecosystem within which it actually is embedded. So this aspiration, it arises out of the practice of biomimicry, which just provides an abundance of design strategies informed by nature that aim to create conditions that are conducive to life. So these 2 questions, they really set out the local aspirations to be thriving people in a thriving place. And lots of places are familiar with that framing. But of course, we know that every place is part of a larger whole. So how can your place respect the health of the whole planet? So what would happen to the global climate and biodiversity and other planetary boundaries if everybody consumed the same way as high consuming societies do? Their food, their clothing, the electronics, the other products, they come with embodied resources in them, and they emit a stream of waste out of them. So what if everyone did that? How would the climate and biodiversity, how could it handle it? And to date, the answer to that question is already no. So how can we transform and move it? And finally, how can your place respect the well-being of people worldwide? So what are the labor conditions of people who work to grow that food or sew the clothing or mine and assemble and ship and deliver the products that flow through your city? But not just supply chains, which are important, of course, but how can your city also acknowledge the cultural connections with others, it's welcoming to migrants, the remittances who are sent to others? How can we start tracing those interconnections and recognize the impacts and that each place has with the rest of the world? So we have been offering these questions to ambitious places because we believe that they underpin so many of the challenges and the opportunities that cities and places face. So as Francisca mentioned at the beginning, it's like we can question growth, but then what's the alternative? And we believe that these questions start offering not answers, but a frame that we can start exploring those for ourselves. And ideally, of course, we want to be measuring quantitative indicators with respect to targets for each of these dimensions. And that's the work that we have been doing. But on top of that, we've also been working together in workshops and participatory setting to start layering on more qualitative types of evidence, like stories and lived experience and photographs and histories, so that it just starts making it a much more rich picture. And what we found really in workshops with policymakers and others is that sitting down and mapping your targets and your indicators and more qualitative data as well, mapping those across each of these four lenses can actually be really empowering, because each person starts to see their sector or their issue or their theme, but they see it in the context of this greater whole. And you can start drawing interconnections and seeing synergies and possibilities that you couldn't, that just weren't visible if you're working in a more siloed way. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple more points, but really I just wanted to mention that Amsterdam was the first city to publish their donut portrait working with this in April 2020, at the height of the first wave of the pandemic. And since then, here's just to give an idea of some of this place-based administrations worldwide who are picking up this portrait methodology, using it together with other tools to envision their own safe and just futures for themselves. Here's an example of putting it into practice in Toronto, where the blue sticky notes are the city targets and the yellow are the more quantitative indicators. But what we asked participants to provide was just to start mapping on challenges and initiatives that they could bring to this workshop setting and start mapping those interconnections across it. But of course, it's not just administrations. This is a community group. We're seeing a lot of energy bubbling up from community change makers, like this neighborhood-based group who are based in Birmingham called Civic Square, who are doing just some fantastic work in terms of laying roots in their neighborhoods and using these tools to really connect with all ages. So I'll wrap up just by saying that we at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we see ourselves as part of this emerging movement of new economic thinking and doing that's gathering momentum if you look in communities, in classrooms, in businesses, in governments, and more. And here's just a few policy relevant documents that have cropped up in the past few months that seem to me to illustrate this growing awareness of the need to take action in the policy sphere. But of course, there are many more, and critically, we need to move from these words and documents into action. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our time together.
Thank you so much, Kate and Andrew. I think the one sentence I really took away was when Kate was talking about circular economies and how that would actually belong on planet Earth, because it is way more like our natural systems, and that what we have right now with the taking and throwing away doesn't belong on this planet. And it's just such a beautiful way of saying, hey, what we are doing is wrong and it doesn't belong here, and we need to change our ways. So anybody, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We had one question, Andrew, asking if you looked at Bhutan as well, and how are they doing in terms of the donut?
Great, thanks. We in this analysis, just for comparative reasons, we actually excluded nations with populations that were less than 1 million, and Bhutan was filtered out of the published study. But of course, since then, we've looked into it, and it's, yeah, their donut follows a similar trend. But of course, their paradigm, the work that they're doing with the gross national happiness and acknowledging the different, the multidimensional nature of well-being, I think is exemplary. But in terms of their environmental performance, it's still overshooting a few boundaries. And in terms of social achievement, they themselves, I believe, would also acknowledge that they have work to do in terms of reaching the social foundation.
Thank you, Andrew. We have a question from Juan Bordera. Juan, do you want to ask your question in person, since it's a bit of a longer one?
Yeah, okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to Kate and Andrew and the organization. The question is, we are usually blamed for not having a plan on how to reach this new economy. And I am interested in linking Doughnut Economics with degrowth. I think they are linked, and with modern monetary theory. Jason Hiker indicates that there's an idea that might be interesting to pursue. There's a link. You can see if there's something interesting in that. And more or less, the idea is that modern monetary theory could be used for transition, Doughnut as the framework to work, and the degrowth ideas, Heikel, Parrique, and Yayo Herrero, could be used as a goal, because we can grow so much more. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this combination, knowing that there's no formula, that it depends on each context. And if it's possible, here's my email. If you can send the presentations, it will be fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. We can share our presentations, I'm sure, with everybody here. I'll jump in. So yes, I would say Doughnut Economics absolutely has a great deal in common with the values and goals of degrowth. We use a different language. And I actually, some years ago, I wrote a kind of blog exchange with Yorgos Kallis. I was arguing that I think degrowth has outgrown its name, just to throw that debate in here, because I think for many people misunderstand it when they hear degrowth. They think it means trying to make GDP go down. When you actually really lean into degrowth and listen, that is not what people mean. So for me, there's an issue about it creates a misunderstanding amongst a far more mainstream audience who desperately need to understand it. So that's my personal view on the word, the name, but hey, you can come back and tell me that Doughnut is a ridiculous name and you'd be right. So it's, you know, we need to find different languages, different framings appeal to different people. So maybe it's valuable to have different ways of expressing these things. But yes, very closely related. Degrowth to me, when I read Jason Hickel on degrowth, what I'm reading is we need to degrow our economy so that we reduce our resource use and come back within planetary boundaries and do it in a managed way that meets the needs of all people. I see a huge connection. And then when it comes to modern monetary theory, yes, I agree that it can absolutely be a tool. And Stephanie Kelton, who is one of the authors, who's written a really good book about modern monetary theory called The Deficit Myth, she and I both said to each other, I wish I could have read your book before I wrote mine. So there's a lot to learn there. I mean, modern monetary policy is available to countries that have their own sovereign currency, so that they have their own capacity to create that currency and to use it, quantitative easing in a kind of, instead of thinking that taxation is the basis of public funding, actually you can create that money into public spending. So yes, in general, I'm going to say I really agree. There's a lot of work. We are at the beginning. We're at the beginning of bringing these rich ideas together and to bringing monetary design together with the goals of ecological living within limits. And I think there's huge value of combining the thinking and the possibilities of Doughnut economics and degrowth in order to get there. I don't know if Andrew wants to add another perspective on that. No. Andrew does a lot of research and work with Jason Hickel anyway, so he's doing data in both of these camps.
Yeah, I guess I will just add that I just completely agree with Kate's comments. Is I think degrowth is a useful framing and a useful field of research in an academic type setting, but as soon as you move into more wider and more diverse audiences, then it can often just create some confusion, I find, with the word, in which case you spend incredibly valuable time debating definitions of what this term means, instead of, you know, the principles and the goals that bring us together. And it's not just degrowth. I would throw capitalism in the same camp, for example. So it's all about finding new language that actually creates that shares the paradigm without getting stuck on, as Kate has framed it, in terms of 20th century luggage.
Okay, we have a few questions that are specific for New Zealand and for Berlin and other places. So maybe those are good questions to answer in the chat. Also, the question in Berlin is about how you can actually use the Doughnut dashboard. Maybe we can go into that a bit, like how can people use the resources? Like how can somebody use this in their community?
I'm happy to jump in there. So the downscaling that Andrew shared, what we call unrolling the donut and those 4 lenses, that is a set of tools that we are just about to publish. And the way we work at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we are a funded organization because we believe what we're doing is putting ideas and tools in the commons. So coming back to the commons, we are putting tools out there for anybody to be able to use in their own processes of transformation if they find these tools useful. So this coming month, we will be publishing those tools. And you get access to a Miro board, you can get access to printout templates on the slides, and then you can adapt them and make them work for your context. And there's explanation of lots of different ways of doing this. So for example, I'll give 2 examples. One, we're working, as Andrew said, with some cities from Amsterdam to Glasgow to Barcelona to Brussels, some nations like Curaçao, North Macedonia, places where governments have said, we find this a useful tool in our own transformation. And then the city government are using the tool, often working together with a local university. Okay, how do we do this analysis? What is our current portrait through the lenses of the donut? And how do we make this transformation? And then there are also community groups. In Berlin, actually, there's a great group called Doughnut Berlin. Look them up. They are doing some really interesting work. So it's a community network. Anybody can join. And saying, how do we bring these tools to life in our city, in Berlin, in Devon, in California, in London, popping up all over the world. And if anybody wants to make one, you can create one of these groups. But I just want to say also for us, a really important principle is don't try to be the movement, join the movement. So you don't have to make a Doughnut economics group. You can take the tools into your existing group. We want to see ourselves as part of the bigger movement, which we consider ourselves alongside you, alongside many other change maker organizations in this emerging ecosystem of change makers. So we create tools that can be used by others in their organizations if you find them useful. It's a very strong principle of ours that we've never once asked anybody or pressured anybody or tried to persuade anybody to use any of these tools. Everything that's happening is because change makers in a place say, this looks useful for my community, for my school, for my city, for my startup. And so that's where the energy is going. I hope that explains. But if you go to doughuteconomics.org, you'll find the existing tools online. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be the first, which is going out tomorrow morning, you will be the first to know when these tools are published.
That is amazing. And I really like your idea of don't just try to be the change, but first see if there's already other people out there you can work with. Caroline would like to add something. So Caroline, you can unmute yourself.
The question was from me. Hi from Berlin. We're in touch with Doughnut Berlin. And my question is more in terms of how can we build bridges? Because there's a big movement on data-driven cities, but it goes in a direction that we don't necessarily agree with. So how can we actually impact also other movements that are driven by paradigms that are more degenerative and destructive to actually move in a direction and offer tools that are applicable in that road or in that way? So my question is more in terms of dashboarding and in terms of algorithm codings. Are you connected to these kind of data-driven communities? And if not, can we have a talk? Can we have a sharing of a couple of ideas how to connect? Because I think it's absolutely crucial to bring these movements together.
I'll say something very briefly, and then I hope Andrew will jump in. So I totally agree with you that there's a lot of talk around smart cities and data, but it's all around the question of in service of what. And actually, I haven't talked about companies or the ownership of technology, but let me just bring up one of my favorite little cutouts. Any enterprise, any technology, any company, any organization, we need to ask, what is it in service to? these smart data-driven cities, what is the purpose of that data? What are the algorithms written in service to? How is it networked? How does that organization network with the residents whose data is being generated, with other forms of data? How is it governed, and who has voice in that? But crucially, how is it owned? How is the organizations and how are the companies that are gathering that data owned, and how are they financed? Because how they're owned and financed will profoundly shape what they're doing with that data, and whether they are simply aiming to monetize it, in which case the purpose will be, you know, we become the product, or are they actually gathering data in service of the goals, such as getting into the donut? So I'm just talking about data here since you brought that example, but for any technology, we have to ask, what's its deep design? At one end, we get organizations or technologies driven by purpose, and we have to make sure that the structure of the organization is aligned with delivering that purpose. Otherwise, we get organizations driven by their ownership and finance in service of generating endless financial returns, and everything else gets skewed towards that purpose. Andrew, do you want to jump in and talk about the vision for data and collaborating with others?
Yeah, sure. So at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we have been working to grow our team, and we've been facing a lot of interest and a lot of energy, and doing our best to respond to that. And I'm holding the data analysis and research themes of our work. And one of the things that I would love to see is to take a more, providing a structure for that type of portrait, unrolling the donut methodology that we spoke about, so that all these different places that are essentially picking it up don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel each time. And so that's a project that I'm interested in getting towards, but we're not there yet. We're just scoping it out. But essentially the idea is to provide a space where the structure, the questions, where data could be uploaded, where you could potentially organize webinars around it, or teaching, or that type of support, so that it's easier to do, and that at the same time you can also be visible to one another. Because yeah, that's another part of our platform that when we launched in September of 2020, it was very much a first version, and that it was just getting it out there. And we're currently working on the design for the next iteration of the platform, with a whole bunch of features that we're hoping to release in the coming months. And it's just very much the spirit of how we're working is getting it out there, sharing the ideas, hearing back. Hopefully people pick them up, they adapt them, they innovate with them, they share back their own ideas, and that we can just kind of work on this together as a big team that is needed in this pivotal decade. So that's where we're at for now. I've noted in your message that you provided an email there, so that's great. And maybe we can pick this up.
Yeah, so we have about 4 to 5 minutes left for questions, and we have two really interesting questions from both Robbie and Kyle. Robbie is asking about how can we do this if there's inequality in global education systems? And I'm pretty sure education is one of the things you have on the inside of the donut. And he's also asking about indigenous cultures and how can they be protected, and their languages as well, and the biodiversity they're mostly in while doing this donut economy.
Those are two big questions. So I don't quite understand. So the first one about inequalities in global education, there are inequalities all over global education. I live in the UK, there's huge inequalities of education, huge use of private education as opposed to public education. But I would want to understand more which inequalities we were talking about, whether it's the mindset that's taught, or inequalities of income between global north and global south. Do you want to clarify that question?
Robbie?
Hello, how are you doing?
Hey.
Well, take the Shetland Archipelago, for example. They have a very distinct language. I've just started working with them. And all their books are in English, just like mine are here in the States, and yours are there in London or wherever you are in the UK. And so that's, they speak one language in the streets and one language at home. and then a different language at school. A lot of the, so there's numerous inequities just in education systems in general, but you know, if we look at the North Sea, that's certainly a biodiversity hotspot. We look in the Caribbean, numerous biodiversity hotspots there. Costa Rica, I think we showed pretty good, had a backwards thing on that little L-shaped chart. And they have several indigenous communities that live there, linguistic communities, and they got their own cultures. And they live in the midst of these biodiversity hotspots. And so how can we protect all these things? You know, and certainly, you know, the Guna, for example, they speak Guna, they talk about their ecosystems in Guna, but they go to school and the education they receive at school is different than the education they receive at home because it's in Spanish. And that education system at school fights the education they receive at home. So, so yeah, I'm talking about general inequities like that you just general, but then I'm talking about some very specific ones with my second question.
Great, thank you. That really clarified. And I would say that just I was talking about the power of images and the power of shape to shape our worldview, but also, of course, words have a phenomenal power. And when a language such as English, I can speak certainly to English that misses so many important words of describing ecological phenomena. And when that language lacks the names of things, they get left out. Hannah Arendt once said, a stray dog has a far greater chance of surviving if it is given a name. And I would say in English language, and maybe in other colonial languages as well, many aspects and phenomena of the living world are treated like a stray dog. And that's why we find ourselves talking about the destruction of the living world as an environmental externality. And if I can just grab that book off my shelf, I'll bet many people on this call have read this book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she speaks so beautifully about the language of her own culture, of her inherited culture, which she has to relearn for herself. And that when you have that language, then you can express things that have otherwise been missing. So thank you, Robbie. I think that's a really important point, as well as drawing new pictures, or indeed learning to learn from old ones and bringing in another language. So I think it's both part of a decolonization of the European and the neoclassical economic mindset that came from European founding fathers of economics and also American. It's a decolonizing of the language and recognizing that other cultures and other languages actually have a far richer relationship with the rest of the living world, and they have a language for describing that. And how do we actually all learn from that rather than eradicate it and lose that very phenomenal awareness that we so urgently need?
Yes, thank you so much for that.
Yes, that was a beautiful answer. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our question time. I would have loved to also hear an answer to Carl's question, but because our interpreters are only here for an hour and a half, we have to move on. And next up is Mike, who's going to tell us a bit about what Scientist Rebellion is. So
can I just say, I'm gonna have to jump off. I've got 3 teenagers. I've got to go and do some caring household work downstairs. So it's been a huge pleasure to join you. A real honor and pleasure. And I hope you have good discussions as you go on. So I'll jump off now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thanks for taking the time.
Pleasure.
And if I may as well, I do have to apologize too that I have two, they're not teenagers yet, but they are about to be. But thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the actions next week, which I of course seen on the website and plan to be a part. So
thank you, Andrew.
Amazing. Yeah, so thanks, Kate and Andrew. So appreciate that I can't hear this. Yeah, so it's always inspiring to hear about kind of, you know, day to day, I do lots about actions, how to try and, you know, change the current system, but it's always good to think about what the system will be on the other side. Obviously, if you don't have some kind of revolution, we're not going to get to that, but it's always good to hear about the kind of system that we're aiming for. But I have to say, I'm not going to be as optimistic or as upbeat, because we are in an emergency, and not just any kind of emergency. We're in the worst kind of situation you could possibly imagine. We're about 30 years late, 40 years late on decarbonisation, and we're in a lot of trouble, and we're probably going to lose as well. I'm just going to go straight in, like there's no point sugarcoating it. It's patronising and it's wrong. We are very likely going to lose this, and we are completely up against it. Nothing could be more important than tackling the climate crisis, like our lives depend on it. So yeah, the thing is that we don't want to think about this, because we know that if we properly take on board the scale of what we have to achieve and how short a time we have, that we'd have to rethink everything, right? If we genuinely accepted that we have a few years to change the world, or we're all going to die forever, along with most life on Earth, then, you know, that's really hard to take in, but that is just the case. And what makes it worse is we don't get another chance. There's this leftist kind of story that, you know, we keep on losing, but we'll win in the end, right? There's a long arc, but in the end we'll get there. And that's great, but it's not true. We have, again, a short number of years, a few years to start genuinely turning off the taps and begin emergency decarbonisation and rewilding and changing the economic system and everything else. And if we miss that window, which we may have already missed, there's a very good chance that it is too late. I'm not going to lie and say, no, it's probably going to be fine. No, we're adults here, let's be honest. It may already be too late, but it may not. And it may be that we can save some lives. And if we don't do this, we're all fucked, right? And that cannot be the end of the human story. The end of the human story should not be, well, you know, what I think keeps me up at night is the idea that when collapse happens, we'll still be increasing emissions. The end of the human story will be they still had the foot on the pedal of the accelerator as they were going off the cliff. They didn't even hit the brakes, right? They were still increasing emissions. They knew, and they didn't have a revolution, right? They knew who was committing the crime. They knew that the industry was doing this, but they didn't storm the gates non-violently and stop this. That's unacceptable, right? No matter what. We owe the people who will die from this crisis, we owe them justice. We know that hundreds of millions will likely die from this. That's already done. Like 1.5 degrees is dead. The Paris Agreement was kind of always a joke, now that we know it's true. That is, it's not going to be kept to. There's no chance we're going to stay below 1.5. And that guarantees catastrophe. That's just true. And that is horrifying. But unfortunately, most of society doesn't know that's true. And the reason they don't know that's true is because, in part, because scientists are not acting as if that's true. Scientists are not running around with their hair on fire, doing whatever they can. They're worrying about funding. They're worrying about their public image. They're worrying about day-to-day shit. They're not acting as if we're in an emergency. They're acting as if it's day-to-day normality and it would be good if we got a revolution, but if not, oh well, it's okay. It's not okay. It will be the end of everything. Again, it's just, it feels like if people understood this, then it would be trivial, but obviously people don't understand this because otherwise we'd have the revolution already. So yeah, I wrote notes, I've not kept to it whatsoever. There was no point me writing notes. So yeah, so basically nothing could be more serious. And if we want to achieve the kind of vision that we've just heard about, then we've got to act on it today. And that doesn't mean somebody else, that means you. Whether you're listening to this now or on YouTube or whatever, it means you taking responsibility. If your child was in a building that was on fire, you would have no hesitancy, I'd hope, to run into that building and to protect that life. All of life will be wiped out by this crisis, all of it, forever, right? If you think you would run into that building, you should do way fucking more than this, right? And if you say, I'm not sure if I'm willing to risk arrest, imagine saying that to your child when things get bad. And they say, why didn't you act? Say, well, I didn't want to be arrested. That's why I didn't act. Think about saying that to them at that moment and about whether you'll be proud or you'll be ashamed, because you don't have long to decide, right? Again, how you behave in the next few years will determine how everything behaves and whether you will be happy with yourself as things hit the fan or not, and whether we win or whether we lose. So this is not the time to make excuses. This is the time to act as if it's the end of the world, right? So this is doom and gloom because that's the reality. But I have some slightly good news. Scientist Rebellion is about to put off something historic. We're about to put off something that essentially people said wasn't possible. You know, I helped set up the group and people said that this wasn't possible. The scientists won't act. But here's the thing, right? Scientists do have privilege, but they know the facts, they know the deal. And it's hard to bring this into yourself, to accept how bad things are. But once you do, it's very obvious what you should do. You should act as if the house is on fire, and you should give up things. You should risk arrest. You should risk your health through hunger strike. You should do these things. Of course, you should do these things. It's blindingly fucking obvious, frankly. So what's our plan, right? How are we going to deal with this? So we have to think big because it's the end of the world as we know it. Ariam told us, and everything kicks off on Monday, April 4th. So on Monday, April 4th is the beginning of the Scientist Rebellion, or the Global Scientist Rebellion, and I think there's a very good chance it's going to spark something in the public psyche that changes how people perceive this crisis, that they see the people in literal white coats who are terrified being on the streets. You know, once the people, the geeks, the nerds, whatever, who never do this kind of thing, doing this kind of thing, that's when we'll be taken seriously, right? So on Monday, April 4th, the Working Group 3 reports will be released that we leaked last August. There has now been over 15,900 requests to edit that report by corporations, governments. So the watered down version will be released on that day, and somebody, name who's on this call, will be helping to analyze that and help with the original report, original leak even. And on that day, on Monday, strikes and occupations are beginning across the world. What is amazing about this strikes and occupations campaign is we're struggling to keep track of it. Like, we've heard of strikes happening in countries where we didn't even know they were happening. There's a real chance this is going to go off like wildfire. Like, that's how fast it's going. On Wednesday, April 6th, so 2 days later, we are doing high-level actions all around the world. We are expecting at least 350 up to 500 at this point. It could be 700, it could be 1,000 just on that day. And we're mobilizing, that's going to be happening in 22 countries around the world. And there's just as many in the global north as global south. So if I remember the countries, which I should, then in Latin America, it is, I should have written this down, Panama, Ecuador, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia. Got it right. Then in the US, we have DC and LA. In Europe, we have a longer list. The UK, Nordic countries, Netherlands, Germany, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Switzerland. I'm sure I've forgotten somewhere, but I think it's most of it. And then in Africa, we have Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sierra Leone, and Tanzania. And Australia, and potentially one other place that I shouldn't name just yet. So this is going to be a truly global event, right? This is going to be the thing that people said wasn't going to happen, that scientists will get on the streets and they'll lead by example. Then on the Friday and Saturday, we are lowering the barrier to entry. So on Wednesday, we need people to act who fully understand their responsibility. So they'll risk arrest, they'll risk imprisonment, they'll risk attending a demonstration in the global south, where if that goes wrong, you get murdered, right? So in the global north, we're risking arrest. In the global south, we know how the situation is. You can end up tortured and killed, right? So people are risking everything on that day. And on the Friday and Saturday, we are lowering the barrier to entry, but we're massively increasing the numbers. So we'll be doing global teach-ins in the UK, in Netherlands, Nordic countries, and so on, where those activists who took action on the Wednesday do teach-ins on the Saturday, as well as other things like pasting scientific papers, doing disruptive roadblocks, those kinds of things, not arrestable, but much higher numbers. Altogether, we're expecting thousands of people to be taking action, and this could be the moment. You know, in nonviolent theory, as is kind of obvious, you know that there's a critical point where once you hit this, then things go crazy in terms of growth. You hit a non-linear growth phase, like we've seen in Extinction Rebellion, and we've seen in Fridays for Future. And it sounds outrageous to put Scientist Rebellion on that kind of alongside those two, but we have to be aiming for that kind of scale, right? We have to be aiming for that, and not just like it would be nice, but like if we fail, then it doesn't mean that we should beat ourselves up, but that is what we're aiming for. We are aiming to change the world, because if we don't in a very short period of time, we're fucked. And yeah, there's something very alluring about scientists actually acting. There's a reason that Scientist Rebellion has been growing, and I think it's not going to stop anytime soon. But here's the deal. It doesn't come for free. The reason we've got here is because people worked incredibly hard. They have given up a lot. Lots of people have been in prison, arrested. Some people have been imprisoned. People have done things they didn't want to do. People have had very difficult conversations with themselves and their partners and said, I have to do this. It doesn't mean it's entirely rational in some sense. It just means I cannot know that billions will likely die and know that I didn't do anything to prevent that. You don't have to think that you're going to save the world. It doesn't have to, you have to have God complex. You can just think that this is your responsibility. This is your, you owe this to the people around you. So again, I just want to reiterate kind of hopefully obvious but terrifying point that this is going to be one of our last chances, right? We're not going to get many more chances at this. So if you're thinking it would be nice, this would be great, but I don't know, got a hair appointment on the 6th, maybe I'll do it next year. No, right? It's this time, right? It's this time. We can do it. We're on the cusp of something incredible. So everyone here and everyone watching, please, join up for action. If somebody can repost the link as I end this thing, then join us in action, join us in mobilizing, tell everyone, donate money if you can. It costs a lot of money to do this. Do everything you possibly can and join us, because if we won't get another chance. And let's just act like our loved ones' lives depend on that, because they do.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I want to tell everybody, like, if you are considering taking action, this is the time to do it. And if you are a scientist or academic, then Scientist Rebellion is a really, really good group to take action in, because it shows your role, and it takes advantage of that role to put more pressure on the governments and on society, and showing that scientists are taking action and that it has to be taken very, very serious. And yeah, like, now is the perfect time to join us, because you can still take part in the April rebellion, which will be so big that if you didn't take part, you're going to beat yourself up that you didn't take this action, because it's going to be amazing. So we're going to start some breakout rooms where you can meet people from local areas. So we have breakout rooms for Southern Europe, for Central Europe, for the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and also for Latin America. So you can meet people there. If you're from none of these areas, just join one of the other groups and learn more about what's happening in Scientist Rebellion and how you can take part, because you don't want to miss out on this. It's going to be pretty epic, and we need everybody to take action to really make a difference.
Franziska, may I just ask a very stupid question? And I
Yes.
apologize, I'm genuinely very curious about, like, what is the mission that we're trying to accomplish by doing this? Are we trying to have people wake up? Are we trying to have governments stop particular things? Like, I mean, going and like getting arrested and stuff, like, that's not reducing emissions. So I'm kind of, I don't see the direct impact. And I'm sorry for being very pedantic. I mean, I take daily actions to reduce my emissions, but getting arrested doesn't make sense to me. So can you just help us see that?
As you may know, with reducing your own emissions, you actually only have control about 50% of your emissions yourself. That's a study they made in France, that the decisions you can make about your emissions only control about 50%. The rest is controlled by companies and by the system we live in and by our government. So that is why it's really important to also speak up and go to demonstrations and do nonviolent direct action. We as Scientist Rebellion chose nonviolent direct action because it has been shown in history that it is the best way to change systems. So we know we need a system change and a transition to a completely different system. For example, doughnut economies, for example, circular economies, in order to make sure that we are all able to live with a small carbon footprint, and not just the really dedicated people who take a lot of time out of their day. We all have to be able to do it. It has to be the easiest and the cheapest choice. And in order to do so, we need a system change. And the most effective way to get a system change is through nonviolent direct actions. So that's why we are getting arrested. Another side benefit is that the media doesn't like to talk about climate change. It hardly ever does. However, if people get arrested, then they have to talk about this because it's something topical, it's happening, and you have another media article talking about climate change. If scientists get arrested, it shows, okay, this is really serious. These scientists are so serious about it that they actually get arrested themselves. And one of our rebels, she got arrested at COP26 last year. And she said, after she got arrested, a lot of her friends and family came up to her asking, how bad is it actually? Well, before seeing what she was doing, they thought it was kind of a hobby of her being an activist. So there's a lot of reasons why scientists getting arrested and also citizens getting arrested will change the system. It's one of the solutions, but a really, really powerful one.
Thank you very much for that explanation.
So we have the breakout rooms signed up, put in, so you can join any of them and get to know each other and get to know some of the people in our group. So have some fun.